Hello, everyone, and welcome to Argue Viking. Today is the official 12th video and unofficial ninth video in my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is the Muscogee Creek Nation, also known as the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, in Alabama and Georgia during the early imperial United States. So, right off the bat, I'm sure basically everyone, at least from the United States, who's watching, if not quite, I'm sure quite a lot of people outside of it as well. Uh, I'm sure y'all have heard of the names Alabama and Georgia, and I'm sure uh, when y'all hear the names Alabama and Georgia, you think of the states in the United States as they are, these two states right here. And of course, that's not an incorrect way to think about it. After all, the state of Georgia and the state of Alabama have had their political boundaries. Their political boundaries have been the same, or the way we know about them on this map here, since the 1840s. So, literally everyone who's been alive today, this is the only way we know about, or the only way we know Alabama and Georgia. So it makes sense that, being that these states have been this way for 160 years, this is how we would imagine them. That being said, that's not the full picture. These states only became the way they are, only took on the shapes that they have now after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the larger picture, we need to go back a little bit farther in time. And with that, that leads us to our first section, the Mississippian period. Of course, focusing specifically on the Mississippian culture. So, the Mississippian culture, as I talked about in my previous two videos, was this culture group that arose in the eastern woodlands of the United States, uh, specifically the Midwest part of the eastern woodlands of the United States around Illinois, starting with the development of the metropolis city known as Cahokia, in somewhere between 900 to 1350 CE, or at least that was its height of power and grandeur and things like that. Um, and that's where Mississippian culture would originate. It would be in that city, which, for those of you who have watched my video on myths about the medieval world, you know that Cahokia had around a population of around 20 to 50,000 people, which was larger than London at the time. Um, so very large city. Uh, and once Mississippian culture rose in the city, it would very quickly spread throughout the rest of the eastern woodlands, as you see here. And eventually it would spread to what is now the state of Georgia, where it would be adopted by the ancestors of the Muscogee Creek, who themselves would build their own large scale metropolitan cities such as the Etowah Mound Site in Cartersville, Georgia, and the Mogi Mound Site in Macon, Georgia, with both having populations of roughly around 16 to 20,000 people, which, not as large as Cahokia, but still fairly large, and uh, still matching, say, the English city of York at the time. However, they themselves would eventually go into decline as chiefdoms, where they would eventually be replaced by the late Mississippian Coosa and Ocute chiefdoms, with the Coosa being seen here and here, and the Ocute chiefdom being seen here and here. And they themselves would of course be connected to Mississippian sites such as the King site, which was specifically connected as the capital of the Coosa chiefdom. And it had its height for only about 100 years, from 1500 to 1600 CE. Which actually brings us to our next section, first contact with Europeans. So, first contact between the ancestors of the Muscogee Creek and Europeans would come during the De Soto expedition, where a conquistador, Spanish conquistador by the name of Hernando de Soto, would lead a group of several hundred men, Spanish men, of course, conquistadors, throughout to the southeast, where, of course, they would encounter a variety of different Mississippian chiefdoms, including, but of course not limited to, the Acute chiefdom and the Coosa chiefdom. And in fact, during this period of time, during this expedition, at one point, De Soto would think it was a good idea to kidnap the chief of the Coosa chiefdom, which makes sense because this was sort of the modus operandi of the conquistadors. When you come into a new kingdom, you kidnap and hold hostage the leader of said kingdom or empire, what have you. He served under, for example, he served under Cortez when Cortez did it to the Triple Alliance, also known as the Aztecs in Mexico, and also served under Pizarro when Pizarro did it to the emperor of the Inca Empire. However, this time it did not go well for De Soto because shortly after kidnapping the chief of Coosa, they came across a town known as uh, Uli Tabala, sorry, Uli Bahali. I do apologize for the mispronunciation, but they would come across a large town within the Coosa chiefdom known as Uli Bahali, where De Soto and his men would very quickly notice that they were outnumbered heavily by the warriors of the Coosa chiefdom there. And that they were well armed with bows and arrows and various types of war clubs. And as I've talked about several times in my previous, whenever I mentioned the De Soto expedition, De Soto makes it very clear that the longbows used by De Soto, by the Native Americans in the southeast could penetrate Spanish armor, and that the warriors were just as skilled with their war clubs as Spanish, as European swords masters were with their swords. So these were very much skilled warriors. And then on top of that, he noticed, and you can read this in this little excerpt from the De Soto expeditions here. This town had walls that are described as being as large as pikes, and with many rails as big as one arm across and things like that. So, walls as tall as a lance. But you get the idea. Very well designed, very heavily fortified fort full of very skilled warriors. And then it says right after that he promptly called upon the chief to come and, tell them to stop, probably against his will. But it's very clear it did not go well for him. And then after the De Soto expedition, the Coosa chiefdom was visited again by another a Spanish conquistador explorer by the name of Tristan de Luna, who would actually go on a slightly different route from De Soto, as you can see here in this map here. And they would sort of, in his expedition, it was a little less eventful. I mean, there were a couple of times where his group and the warriors of the Coosa chiefdom sort of helped each other out, fight mutual enemies and things like that. But generally, it was relatively uneventful. There is one key exception to that I will get to in just a little bit. And then after that, there would be the Juan Pardo expedition that would visit the Coosa chiefdom, or at least parts of the Coosa chiefdom, the parts of the Coosa chiefdom that were located in Tennessee, as you can see here. And he would actually build a series of forts during this process throughout various different chiefdoms, including the Jawara and the Cofidachequi chiefdoms. But again, this really didn't end well for him. Eventually, for example, the warriors of the Jawara kingdom chiefdom would like launch a coordinated attack against all of the forts and burn them down. So, all right, so this is the one exception to the sort of uneventfulness of the Tristan de Luna expedition. So de Luna and Pardo go out of their way to talk about uh, how much the population seems to have declined in between their expeditions and the De Soto expedition. Um, and this is largely due to the spread of infectious diseases brought by the Spanish explorers, such as smallpox and measles, which just decimated the Native American populations of really both the North and South American continents because of their lack of antibodies against these diseases. And this would lead to the drastic population decline and then the eventual collapse of both the Kusa and the acute chiefdoms by at the latest 1600 CE. I mean, of course, there's some debate about when exactly that collapse happened, but the latest date would be somewhere in 1600, maybe 1610 CE. And here is smallpox, and there is measles. And this uh, population decline has actually been studied very extensively by archaeologists and virologists and things like that. In fact, it's discussed in detail in this paper from 2014 about spatiotemporal analysis of old world diseases in North America by Eric E. Jones. And he looks at a variety of different records from various different states, including Florida, um, here Santa Fe, the Carolinas, etc. And here's a sort of a look at the map of those earliest archaeological and historic evidence of the depopulation of this region, as you see here. And you can see here sort of that information where he talks about all of the evidence that we have for this these events happening. And as you can see, as seen in this graph, the archaeological findings match the historical documents, at least in to at least to some degree. And you can see sort of the what the historical documents are saying, the type of diseases that they found around this time, and smallpox is the one that shows up the most commonly. Of course, measles does as well. And here is again that map sort of showing the spread here. And here's a map showing all the various like population differences and declines there. However, there is also one caveat to this as well, and this is talked about actually by a little bit earlier than Eric Jones's paper by Robert L. Blakely and Bettina Detweiler Blakely in their paper titled "Impact of European Diseases on in the 16th Century Southeast: A Case Study." And so what they did in this paper is they decided to look at things like the size, density, and distribution of populations of each site, of each like village site, and things like that to determine, of course, like also look at, injury marks on bones and things like that to determine how much disease affected specifically the king site, the capital of the Kusa chiefdom and things like that. And what they found is that quite a lot of these burials and these wounds they found on people in these burials oftentimes were more in line with things like being killed in battle with Spaniards, which are these shaded portions here. And there was a lot more a larger percentage of wounded people who died of wounds than other causes and things like that. And you can see that sort of their thinking here that like low levels of non-specific stress plus low levels of mortality equals absence of epidemics, and then the opposite equals, low level of non-specific stress plus high levels of mortality equals epidemics. And you can see their sort of percentage of the mortality that they found here. Uh, and you can see sort of all the various different injuries that they found, including fatal injuries, healed injuries, and others. So what they found in this is that there, at least at the King site, there's a lot more evidence of people dying in battle than there is of dying from disease. That being said, they state it very clear that they are not at all, like right here in this final sentence of their conclusion, they are not disputing. In fact, no one disputes that the 16th century Spanish explorations of the Southeast touched off the greatest genocidal tragedy of the region. Um, and they are also not suggesting that Native Americans in the southeastern United States were saved catastrophic losses from European diseases. But what they are saying is that chiefdoms farther inland, like the Coosa chiefdom and the Okiu chiefdom and the Joar chiefdom, things like that, seem to have had a much better chance and much less likely chance of contracting these diseases um, than people on the coast, than chiefdoms on the coast. And that makes sense because those would be the first places that the Spanish landed on, of course, coming by, via boat. The most accessible and the most immediate places that the Spanish could get to. And again, this doesn't mean that disease didn't eventually spread to the Coosa and Acute and Joar chiefdoms and things like that. Because if we go back to a few slides here, uh, to this map here, you can see that this map does show that the archaeological evidence proves that the diseases did eventually spread inland. It just seems that they did that at a much slower rate than one might think, at least compared to coastal areas. All right, so now that brings us to our next section, the rise of the Muscogee Confederacy. So, after the collapse of these chiefdoms, such as Coosa and Ocute, uh, various different confederacies, new Native American confederacies and nations would rise from the sort of ashes of these Mississippian chiefdoms, including the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, which would rise as a loose alliance of Muscogee-speaking peoples as early as the early 1600s CE, and would go on to have a rather large range consisting of central and southern Georgia, southeastern Georgia, sorry, for the most part, and southeastern Alabama as their general territorial home. And very quickly, they would actually have contacts with the British and the Spanish. So just 70 years, we'll say, to be conservative, so we don't know exactly when in the early 1600s that they rose, say maybe 1620s, from roughly between, roughly between, we'll say 30 to, 60 years after they rose, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would come into contact with the British Empire, who would found the city of Charlestown, modern day Charleston, South Carolina, in the New Carolina colony. Back then, there were not two Carolinas, there was just one. And they would found this. I put 1670 CE here, but this map shows 1665. So between 1665 and 1670 is when they founded Charleston and the Carolina colony. And just shortly in conjunction with that, while that was going on, the Spanish were sending Franciscan friars and missionaries into what is now Florida to build missions, churches and things like that along the Appalachian Bay, uh, as seen here on this map. So, uh, eventually, that would lead, especially the founding of Charlestown, and the founding of the Carolina colony, would lead the Muscogee Creek Confederacy to become one of the major participants in what would be known as the deerskin trade, which would be a major trade industry from the 1670s CE to the 1800s CE. And I do mean that the Muscogee Creek Confederacy were not the only ones who were doing this, as you can see here. But of course, right now we're specifically talking about the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. Not only that, another industry that would rise fairly quickly after the founding of Charlestown, as well as other European colonies, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, and again other Native American nations, would become major participants in the Native American slave, the Native American slave trade, often practicing raids on rival Native American nations, such as the Appalachee, seen here on this map, uh, where for example, the Muscogee Creek would launch a raid on the Appalachee to capture prisoners to sell into slavery in ports and other European cities in Carolina, uh, and then they would eventually be sent to, for example, the West Indies or the Caribbean. Not only that, and in fact, a symptom of this Native American slave trade would eventually lead the Muscogee Creek Confederacy to help the British win the Tuscarora War, which I've already done a video on that will be included in the iCard. This is a war that started because of the Native American slave trade. The Tuscarora, in fact, were part of these groups that would bring enemy captives to sell, but they themselves began to realize that eventually they too would succumb to the Indian slave trade. So they started this war to try and push European colonists out. They almost won, and really they only lost due to the help of Native American nations such as the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and also the Cherokee. But that's a subject for another video. However, despite their help in defeating the Tuscarora in the Tuscarora War, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, as well as other Native American nations who also helped the British during the Tuscarora War, would essentially realize what the Tuscarora had. It's like, oh, we're going to be next if we don't do something about this. And so the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, along with other Native American groups such as the Yamasee, would start the Yamasee War pretty much immediately after the Tuscarora War, only to themselves be defeated by the British in this war. And again, the only reason they lost was actually because of the intervention of a equally powerful Native American nation as the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the Yamasee, and that would be the Cherokee you see here. And then after the Yamasee and the Tuscarora War, the British Empire would sort of, as well as other European nations like Spain, like the Spanish Empire, would begin to realize that perhaps the Native American slave trade was too risky of a venture. And so they would gradually begin replacing it with African chattel slavery. Now, it should be important to note African chattel slavery did exist before this, but it was not quite as prevalent as it would become until after the Tuscarora and Yamasee Wars. So, uh, and then something else important to note while all of this was going on, um, starting as early, at least as early as the 1710s CE, Scotch-Irish migrants from the UK, from Scotland and Ireland, would begin to migrate into the American Southeast, where they would begin living both within and outside of Native American nations, including but not limited to the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. Around 20 years after the Tuscarora War, the British Empire would send James Oglethorpe to found the colony of Georgia. And of course, I've already done a video on this that will be linked in the iCard. Uh, uh, James Oglethorpe had some issues doing this by himself. And so eventually he would enlist the help of the Muscogee Creek Miko, the Creek word for chief or ruler, Tamachichi, as well as Muscogee Creek trader Mary Musgrove, to help him found this colony of Georgia. And again, I've covered that in greater detail already in a video that I'll include in the iCard, but it's still important to bring up because the Muscogee Creek Confederacy were very integral. In fact, probably the only reason that James Oglethorpe was able to, if not found the colony of Georgia in general, at least they were integral into him founding it as easily as he did. All right, now that brings me to our next section and the meat of the video, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the United States. Starting with the warfare between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the United States. So, of course, as everyone from America knows, the American Revolution would begin in 1776 when the 13 British colonies decided to rebel and revolt against the British Empire. During this American Revolution, Muscogee Creek Miko Alexander McGillivray would orchestrate an alliance between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and dragging canoes Chickamauga Cherokee, with the alliance joining the British against the colonists. And I've already done a video on this as well that we will also be included in the iCard. But of course, eventually, as anyone from America, at least watching this knows, the colonists would win the American Revolution, but that did not end the fighting between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the United States, because after the United States eventually wins the American Revolution, and of course, yes, for those of you who are watching, yes, the United States had not technically been created yet, but the people who would create the United States won the American Revolution, so bear with me. But the United States would win the American Revolution, and the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would remain a key member of Dragging Canoe's Native American alliance against the United States, and would continue to fight them for about 12 years. And during these 12 years, Alexander McGillivray would negotiate what is known as the Treaty of Pensacola with Spain, where the Spanish Empire would recognize Muscogee Creek control over 3 million acres of land claimed by Georgia, and would guarantee the Muscogee Creek Confederacy access to the British firm Penton, Leslie and Company, which was a key company that controlled the deerskin trade, with McGillivray making himself the official, or at least an official representative of Spain. And this would happen in 1784 CE. Just 2 years later, on November 3rd, 1786 CE, 8 commissioners representing the state of Georgia and 59 headmen of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would meet near the mouth of Shoulderbone Creek on the banks of the Oconee River to sign a treaty of, quote, amity, peace, and commerce, with an article of the treaty including the cession of all lands east of the Oconee River to the United States. And to ensure faithful performance, the Muscogee Creek headmen would leave in the hands of the Georgians 5 of the men present. All these actions, of course, were heavily protested by Alexander McGillivray, who contended that the representation of the Muscogee Creeks at Shoulderbone Creek was not sufficient to speak for the Confederacy. And he was probably right, at least in the way that the Muscogee Creek Confederacy saw it. And for reference, that territory that they ceded would be right about here on this map. And then, just 4 years after that, McGillivray and 29 other Muscogee Creek chiefs would travel to New York in the summer of 1790 CE on behalf of all of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, including the, quote, upper, middle, and lower Creek, as well as the Seminole composing the Creek Nation of Indians, or they would sign what is known as the Treaty of New York, which would cede a large portion of Muscogee Creek land to the federal government. And also, the treaty promised to return fugitive slaves in return for federal recognition of Muscogee sovereignty and promises to evict white settlers. Though it's important to note, while they signed this treaty, McGillivray and the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would still continue to fight in Dragon Canoe's Native American alliance against the United States. But of course, that too would come to an end eventually, as I talked about in my video on the Cherokee-American War that was led by Dragon Canoe, which again, I will link in the iCard. This war would eventually come to an end with the Treaty of Tellico Blockhouse, officially ending the Cherokee-American War and temporarily ending hostilities between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the United States, essentially ending the Cherokee-American War as a stalemate. Now, as I talked about in the video on the Cherokee-American War, but I think is important to talk about now as well, the United States called the Cherokee-American War a United States victory, but if you actually get into the meat of what happened and look at every event and all the strategic victories and things like that, this Cherokee-American War was more akin to what you would like, for example, the Korean War was, where essentially nobody gained any territory, nobody really gained much of anything, and it essentially ended with the territory being mostly the same. I mean, there were minor land cessions, but for the most part, the territories between both the Cherokee Nation and the United States were roughly the same by the end of the war. Same with the Muscogee Creek, with the exception of the one land cession, 2 minor land cessions we just talked about. All right, and this brings us to a subsection that we need to talk about, which is the temporary and tenuous peace between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the United States. So, during this period of tenuous peace, Alexander McGillivray would actually die in 1793 CE. And this would lead the Muscogee Creek Confederacy to lose a powerful political voice against the United States. Not the only powerful political voice, but still, it was a loss of a powerful and very influential political opponent of the United States. And at the same time, the invention of the cotton gin would actually exacerbate things because it would lead white settlers on what was then known as the southwestern frontier who hoped to become cotton planters to begin clamoring for Native American lands in that region. And here is a cotton gin here. And because of this, one of these examples of white Americans clamoring for Native American land was the attempt by Elijah Clark and several hundred followers to actually defy the Treaty of New York and establish what would be known as the Trans-Oconee Republic. That was a very short-lived republic and really just only lasted, I think, about a year, give or take. Sorry, 2 years, give or take, but you get the idea. Did not last very long at all. But that would be not be the last time that this would happen. And in fact, a more concerted federal effort by the United States federal government to clamor for this Native American land would begin when George Washington developed George Washington and his cabinet, but George Washington being the leader of this, would develop the quote, what is known as the quote Sixpoint Plan to civilize, even though they were already, calling someone civilized is a very loaded term. Anyways, the southeastern Native American nations, and to do this, George Washington would appoint Benjamin Hawkins as general superintendent of all air quotes Indian affairs dealing with all Native American nations south of the Ohio River, with Hawkins eventually personally assuming the role of principal agent of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy in 1796 CE. But of course, it's important to note that while McGilvery died, that would not be the end of political backlash within the Muscogee Creek Confederacy for the signing of these treaties. In fact, an American-born Muscogee Creek adoptee, i.e., a white American by the name of William Augustus Bowles, would denounce the treaties that were negotiated both before and by Alexander McGilvery that were negotiated with Spain and the U.S. And so William Augustus Bowles, denouncing these, would go and found what was known as the state of Muscogee in what is now Florida, with the support of the Chattahoochee Muscogee Creeks as well as the Seminole Nation. And he would also go on to actually issue a death sentence against Benjamin Hawkins himself, though he would also fail to actually form an alliance with the lower Muscogee Creek towns. And he would found the state of Muscogee in 1799 CE. After founding the state of Muscogee, he would build a small navy of schooner ships, which he would use to raid Spanish ships in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course, therefore declaring war on Spain. And he would even briefly capture the Presidio and trading post of San Marcos de Apalache before eventually being forced to retreat by a much larger Spanish force in 1800 CE. Eventually, a European armistice would lead to the loss of British support, which Bowles had actually managed to get. And this, in turn, would lead Bowles to be discredited, and the Seminole Nation would sign a peace treaty with Spain and officially sort of remove itself from its alliance with Bowles's state of Muscogee. And then the following year, Bowles would be betrayed by or Bowles, sorry, I've been saying Bowles, but Bowles would be betrayed by the lower Muscogee Creek supporters of Hawkins at a national council, where they would then turn Bowles over to the Spanish, where he would die in prison in Havana, Cuba, just 2 years later. One thing I do want to mention very quickly, Bowles is also the name of a Cherokee chief that I've already done a video on. They are not the same people at all. The two completely different people. It's just interesting that these two people have very similar names. Uh, while this was happening, while Bowles was being captured and sent to Havana uh, to be put in prison, the lower Muscogee Creeks would eventually cede their lands east of Ocmulgee to Georgia, with the exception of the sacred burial mounds of the Ocmulgee Mound site. Uh, and they would do this in 1805 CE. And here is the Ocmulgee Mounds here. And here is that sort of area that they ceded during that time. Uh, Also, during this period of time, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would allow a federal road linking New Orleans to Washington, D.C. to be built through their territory, and it would be built somewhere between 1805 to 1806 CE. And here's a map of that federal road here. And just shortly after the federal road is built and the territory east of Ocmulgee was ceded to the United States, would construct Fort Benjamin Hawkins actually on a hill overlooking the Ocmulgee Mounds in order to protect the expanding United States settlements, and also to, of course, serve as a forward operating base for future wars and invasions and things like that of other Native American nations. Uh, but of course, this section is known as the tenuous and temporary peace between the United States and the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. Um, and this is actually why I called it that, because during somewhere between March and December of 1811 CE, Shawnee Chief Tecumseh would travel amongst the southeastern Native American nations, including the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, where he would attempt to recruit them into his Pan-Native American alliance against the United States. He would largely fail, with nations such as Native American nations such as the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw refusing to join his confederacy. And actually, even a large chunk of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would refuse to join his Pan-Native American alliance. However, that also means he did succeed in recruiting half of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, and this happened because he apparently accurately predicted the arrival of what would become known as the Great Comet of 1811 CE, and also the New Madrid earthquake, both of which would eventually ignite a civil war in the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. Which now brings us to the Muscogee Creek Confederacy in the War of 1812 CE. So the United States would go to war against the British Empire in the War of 1812 CE, as we've talked about several times in several videos actually in this series. And during that conflict, during the opening, battles and years of that conflict, the Muscogee Creek faction that had joined Tecumseh's Confederacy, now calling themselves, quote, Red Sticks, for the Red War clubs that they wielded, would declare war on the United States by initiating what would become known as the Fort Mims Massacre, where essentially 1,000 Muscogee Creek warriors would storm Fort Mims and slaughter the United States soldiers within. And there's the sort of outline of the fort there. And these Red Sticks would be led by various Muscogee Creek Mikos, such as William Weatherford and Manawa, who would then lead the Red Stick faction in siding with the British Empire in the War of 1812, which is something that also Tecumseh's Pan-Native American Alliance did as well. However, after a long one year long war, the Red Stick faction would be permanently defeated by an alliance between the United States and Native American nations such as the Cherokee. In fact, mirroring the earlier conflicts that the Muscogee Creek Confederacy fought with the British Empire, the only reason the Red Stick faction lost this war was primarily because of the Cherokee warriors who fought alongside the United States, but also because of the other half of the Muscogee Creek Nation uh, that fought on the side of the United States, as well as to a lesser degree the Choctaw and the Chickasaw Nation. As a result of the Red Stick faction losing the Creek War, Andrew Jackson would force the entire Muscogee Creek Confederacy, including the ones who fought on the side of the United States during the war, to cede 21 million acres of Muscogee Creek land to the United States. And again, this would be done despite the protests from the Muscogee Creeks who fought on his side. And that all of that land that was ceded to the United States can be seen here in orange. But the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would not be done fighting because they would participate in what would become known as the First Seminole War. So, in the wake of the Creek War, many Muscogee Creek, including a young Osceola, would flee to Florida and join and become members of the Seminole Nation. And they would do this between 1814 and 1816 CE. Because of this, and because of the fact that the Seminole Nation itself was a powerful military force, at least to a degree, would lead to rising tensions, but rising border tensions between the Seminole Nation and the United States. And this would be mainly because of the rising population of the Seminole Nation from the influx of the Muscogee Creek refugees from the Creek War, but also because of runaway enslaved African Americans who had escaped enslavement to flee to the Seminole Nation, who would take them in. Not only that, the British Empire was arming the Seminole Nation with European-made guns, like the type of musket commonly known as Brown Betsy, which was a very well-designed musket. And then all of this together would eventually prompt Andrew Jackson to lead a United States Army into Florida and invade the Seminole Nation. Where he would, between 1817 and 1818 CE, destroy multiple Seminole towns and eventually force the Seminole Nation to surrender, essentially. And then right after that, because of the Seminole War, as well as realizing that they can no longer adequately defend or control Florida, the Spanish Empire, who at least in theory ruled and controlled Florida, would cede Florida to the United States in the Adam Onis Treaty on February 22nd of 1819 CE. And here's a map of sort of that, the implications of that treaty here. All right, so now that brings us to our next section. A look at what Muscogee Creek society looked like during this period of time. Starting with Muscogee Creek culture. So Muscogee Creek society, much like most of the Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands, was a matrilineal society, meaning kinship is traced through the mother's line, through the female line. You identify with your mother's lineage, property is passed down through the mother's family, and children are born into the clan of the mother and take their social status from it. To put contrast to this would, in modern American culture, modern United States culture, we trace our lineage from our fathers and things like that, making us a patrilineal society. In that same line, Muscogee Creek society was matrilocal, meaning when a young couple married, they would live with the woman's family. Women were in charge of agricultural planting, harvesting, and harvesting the crops, as well as they were the ones who owned the agricultural fields. And it is important to note that biological fathers were important within the family system, but they had to come from a different clan from the mother. And in fact, they were not the most important uh, sort of male role model for children. That would actually be the mother's brother from her clan, i.e., the mother's nearest blood relation, and he would function as the primary teacher, protector, disciplinarian, and role model for children, especially boys. Also, an important thing to point out is clan members did not necessarily claim blood relation, but they still considered each other as family due to their membership in the same clan. This kid is expressed by their usage of the same kinship titles for both family and clan relations. For example, clan members of approximately the same age would consider each other brother and sister, even if they had never met before. And then men would be specifically the ones who were chiefs, i.e., Mikos, would be in charge of war and hunting. And here are all of my sources for this information. Then we need to look at Muscogee Creek warfare. So, warfare was actually fairly infrequent among Muscogean peoples, speaking peoples prior to the arrival of Europeans. The archaeological record of the Mississippian Southeast does display a remarkable array of material cultural remains that are associated with warfare, but this does not demonstrate any frequency of warfare, just the presence of it. Um, Warfare was important, an important way for men to gain social prestige. Warriors of higher ranking would be provided a seat at council meetings around the square ground, i.e., the center of Muscogee Creek life and their settlements. Medicine bundles and rituals were essential to the success of warfare. And success in warfare would actually allow the medicine to be used in positive ways, uh, which would lead to the medicine becoming more powerful and more protective of the town, and actually further the success of the campaign would be furthermore the success of the campaign is actually dependent on the successful completion of related ritual and ceremonies. And it's important to note medicine bundles were talismans that were passed down from through the family line. Uh, Prior to departure in, in warfare, a contingent of warriors who was going off to war would have to complete 2 to 3 days of rituals and fasting, with these rituals being done to essentially cleanse and purify their bodies and remove any distractions and evil, thus ensuring success in combat. Warfare in itself mainly consisted of raids and ambushes and is often focused on obtaining captives. Uh, Warriors would often employ tactics such as frontal assaults, the use of fortifications for defense, using horses for flanking maneuvers. Once horses, of course, were reintroduced to North America and the Americas, the modification of natural environments into highly defensible positions, using rugged natural environments such as dense forest and swamps to both avoid and ambush enemy soldiers. And warriors would also provide rear guard actions such as conducting leapfrogging cover during a retreat, i.e., somebody would fire and then run away, and the person who had already been running away would stop and fire, and they would repeat the process. Often, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and other Native American nations would use a game known as stickball as a substitution for war to settle disputes between nations and villages, as well as between just individuals. The Muscogee Creek Confederacy and other Native American nations of the Eastern Woodlands would also use stickball as a way to train young men in the ways of war. And this was done because of its roughness. And they would also, because of its roughness, use it as a preparation for imminent wars and raids. All of these practices would lead stickball to be called the little brother of war. Estimates of how many Muscogee warriors the Muscogee Creek Confederacy could field range as low as around 2,000, 2,063 warriors to as many as 5,000, with a warrior to general population ratio of roughly 16 to 5 at the lowest and 7 to 2 at the highest. To put this in perspective, as we talked about in my video on the era of good feelings, and on my video about the Northwestern Confederacy and Northwestern War, which I will include in the iCard. The United States military, during much of its early history, generally only had an army of around 1,000 to 3,000 people, and even at its highest, you know, 16,000 people, that would only last during the War of 1812, and after the War of 1812, that was brought down to just 6,000. So, for most of the United States' history, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy was a legitimate military equal, military opponent to the United States. And here's a depiction of stickball here. And with that, we also need to take a look at what Muscogee Creek warriors and weapons look like during this period of time. So this is generally what Muscogee Creek warriors look like. They wore a variety of different outfits that were very similar, but not necessarily the same. You see here, of course, a lot of them would wear various types of war paint. And they would wield a variety of different weapons, mainly various different types of war clubs, such as the tomahawk, which is the most thought of and most well known Native American weapon. And of course, the Muscogee Creek would use it, but it's important to note that the tomahawk is essentially a subset of the weapon known as the war club. The other generally more common types of war clubs that were wielded would be things like the gun stock war club you see here, and these are shaded red because these are replicas of war clubs that the Red Six would have used, or war clubs like this that were very similar to maces in Europe generally. They would, of course, also use various types of knives, with steel knives eventually replacing the traditional stone or copper and bronze knives that were fairly endemic in the Americas prior to European arrival. Yes, metalworking did exist prior to European arrival. It just consisted of bronze and copper metalworking, not steel or iron. And of course, after European contact, and by the 1800s, the Muscogee Creek used as their primary ranged weapons muskets like this Brown Bess musket that you see here, and of course would also use flintlock pistols like you see here. All right, now we need to take a look at the government of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. So, starting off, the most important leaders of Muscogee society were the Mikos, or village chiefs. They would be the ones who would lead warriors in battle and represent their village, but they only held authority insofar as they could persuade others to agree with their decisions. Right, I don't want to say below them, but we'll say just as important as they were the clan mothers, who were the most who were mostly women elders whose authority would complement the authority of the Mikos, i.e., they were equal. Then, right after the Mikos and the clan mothers, you had the second in commands of the villages, and then after that, you had the village members of the village council, the village elders, who were the advisors to the Miko, to the village chief. Then you had the ranking warrior or the war chief, who was the principal military advisor. And then you had the medicine maker, who would officiate various rituals, including providing the black drink, which was used in purification ceremonies. And then within all of that, you had the clan, which was the most important social unit that would be in charge of organizing hunts, distributing land, arranging marriages, and punishing lawbreakers. The Muscogee Creek Confederacy itself would be organized into coalitions of villages, such as the upper and lower towns, rather than centralized units or decentralized towns. The government of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy was therefore corporate in nature. In essence, decision making was shared among several groups. Sources of power were accessed by stressing social solidarity and the interdependence of decision makers and followers. Mobilized surplus was used to fund solidarity building, communal rights of intensification, and individual wealth and status was subsumed to the importance of the corporate whole. And here are the sources that I used for all of that information. Now let's take a look at the criminal justice within the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. So, as we talked about in the previous slide, the clan is in charge of punishing lawbreakers. So, women as leaders of clans maintain the principle of retaliation as well as their own authority in politics, meaning that they also had a lot of authority in punishing lawbreakers. Things like murder was usually dealt with by revenge. Stolen property was usually punishable by returning the stolen goods or other compensation. And then after that, theft would be later on in in the 1800s. Theft would be later punishable by a whip, i.e. by lashing. Acts such as adultery were also to be punished by whipping, and also to be punished by the cutting off of ears. And this would go for both men and women. However, men tended to punish women more often than women punished men. Also, incest was considered a crime, and again, this sort of counted for like marrying somebody within your own clan, regardless of blood relation. And that's, again, remember, if we go back to the Muscogee Creek culture, everyone in the clan, regardless of blood relation, was considered a family member, so it's still counted as incest. Eventually, Muscogee Creek Miko William McIntosh would establish a police force known as the Law Defenders, and eventually other groups such as the Muscogee Creek Light Horse Division, and the Muscogee Creek Council would also formulate laws in what would become known as the Code of 1818, which would be designed to protect communal tribal property within the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. And again, as the name, the Code of 1818 suggests, this was done in 1818 CE. And here are all the sources that I used for that. All right, now we are going to take a look at Muscogee Creek villages. So generally, Muscogee Creek villages were, well, of course they were like the other villages of other Native American nations within the Eastern Woodlands. But what I really want to say is they were not that dissimilar from European towns and villages, which of course you can see here. Prior to European contact, they were generally made of this sort of clay, wattle and daub sort of style homes, but of course they also had some variation of log cabins and things like that. But of course, after European contact, they would gradually adopt and use in much higher frequencies log cabin style houses. And between the 1810s and 1830s, Muscogee Creek villages would begin to adopt American style buildings such as blacksmiths and United States style taverns. Here is a tavern here and a blacksmith here. And now it is time for us to talk about the economy of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. So, starting off, the traditional Muscogee Creek agriculture was based on crops such as corn, beans, and squash, which was generally the traditional agriculture used in all of the eastern woodlands nations, Native American nations. But it wasn't just focused on that. Muscogee Creek also harvested wild plants such as blackberries, plums, and hickory nuts. And Muscogee Creek men would hunt and harvest animals such as deer, wild turkey, and various types of fish. And of course, as we talked about earlier in the video, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy was a major participant in the deerskin trade, which can actually be found in the archaeological record, as discussed in this paper by Barnett, Paval, Zuckerman, titled Deerskins, Domesticates, Creek Subsistence, and Economic Strategies in the Historic Period. And as the title suggests, Paval Zuckerman took a look at the various subsistence and economic strategies of Muscogee Creek communities during this period in time. And what he found is that was, of course, unsurprisingly, a high frequency of butchered deer remains in the various sites across a wide range of time, ranging from the Tassi, early Tallapoosa, all the way to the late Tallapoosa periods. And you can see that high frequency here in these graphs with the areas that are colored in this sort of check mark, checkerboard coloring representing deer remains. And there's another graph sort of showing that as well. Not only that, of course, as I sort of, mentioned, these remains of deer were butchered, and you can see that based off of a variety of different cut marks as seen in this little diagram here on the deer bones, meaning that, of course, the Muscogee Creek were butchering deer, hunting deer in high numbers and butchering them, and of course, skinning them and tanning their hides, their deer, the deer hides, where they would then proceed to take the deer hides to various forts and American and European towns, first British towns and then American towns, such as Fort Hawkins, Mogi Old Fields, Fort Wilkinson, Coleraine, etc., where they would be sold in European markets. And you can see that here in these graphs. For example, the annual exports from towns in the lower south to Britain included 37,000 deer skins. And you can see here in these graphs the value of deer skins exchanged at places like Fort Wilkinson, being a major factory store hub, where the deer skins would be sold off and exported, and also processed to some degree into new clothing and things like that. And here is the average number of deer skins that were traded per transaction just between 1804 and 1806 at Fort Wilkinson. Though it's important to note the average data for July, for between July and November, is missing. Another after effect of European contact with the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would be the eventual adoption of European plantation farming and African chattel slavery, i.e., wealthy Muscogee Creek council members, village heads, etc., would begin adopting the plantation economy and build plantations and would begin utilizing uh, enslaved African Americans. Now, something that I absolutely that if there is nothing else that you take away from this slide and the next one I'm about to show you, is that the treatment of African American slaves by the Muscogee Creek were just as brutal as treatment the by plantation owners in the United States. And I say this, and I said this in my video about the Choctaw Nation a couple of videos ago, and I will say this in every video about the tribes of the American Southeast because it is something that must absolutely be driven home. In my career as an archaeologist and a historian, and in my career having worked at museums connected to Native American nations such as the Cherokee and the Muscogee Creek, I have often heard the idea that enslaved African Americans uh, were treated far better in nations like the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the Cherokee Nation than they were in the United States. That is absolutely not true at all, and it erases the experiences of the enslaved African Americans within these nations. The enslaved African Americans were subjected to the exact same treatments that they were in the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and other nations like the Cherokee Nation as they were in the United States. And of course, these punishments include things like lashings and, starvation, beatings, being shot and killed, sexual assault, you name it, it happened. It very much was not good, period, across the board, no matter where you were, whether it be the United States, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, say in the Caribbean, what have you. Across the board, it was not good to be an enslaved African American. It was not a good experience. Please do not think that they were treated better. That does not mean that this justifies the United States actions against the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, which we'll talk about later in the video. But that also does not mean that we need to diminish what happened to enslaved African Americans in the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and other southeastern Native American nations. And again, you will hear this rant and or at least very similar rants in other videos about other Native American nations in the Southeast. But as annoying as that's going to get, I would rather be annoying and get my point across than history, accurate history be ignored, especially the accurate history about the lived experiences of people, of enslaved African Americans, who are also literally just probably, just the great grandfathers at most of people alive today, because this was not that long ago. Anyways, now we're going to move on and talk about something a little bit different that was happening in the Muscogee Creek Nation. Muscogee Creek Confederacy. So between the early 1800s and the 1820s CE, Baptist and Methodist missionaries would begin entering the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, where they would start building mission stations and United States-style schoolhouses in an attempt to convert the Muscogee Creek. However, one should be important to note: the Muscogee Creek were generally more interested in the things that these schools could provide, like teaching of American trade, skills and trades and things like that, like say blacksmithing and silver working. In addition to not to replace, but in addition to traditional Muscogee Creek education. However, after learning that many of these Baptist and Methodist missionaries were in favor of the idea of Indian removal, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would begin to force the missionaries out of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. And here is a mission station and a American-style schoolhouse. So this actually brings us to our next section, our next major section of the video, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and Indian removal. So negotiations between the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and Georgia, the state of Georgia, would eventually result in Muscogee Creek land cessions to the United States in what would become known as the First Treaty of Indian Springs. However, after this treaty was signed, the Muscogee Creek National Council would swear not to cede any additional land to the United States and would actually go so far to decree a sentence of death for the violation of that pledge. All this would happen in January 8th of 1821 CE. However, just 4 years later, against the wishes of the Muscogee Creek National Council, William McIntosh would cede Muscogee Creek territory east of the Flint River to Georgia, and what would become known as the Second Treaty of Indian Springs, which would eventually result in his assassination by several Muscogee Creek council members. And this would all happen on February 12th, 1825 CE. Just a year later, in 1826 CE, a delegation of the Muscogee Creek National Council, led by Miko Apotheohola, would be sent to Washington, D.C., where they would actually succeed in negotiating a more favorable treaty, which would become known as the Treaty of Washington, with President John Quincy Adams. Right after the signing of the Treaty of Washington, many Muscogee Creek would begin to voluntarily migrate west of the Mississippi to Arkansas between 1827 and 1828 CE. But of course, the time would come when it would be no longer voluntary. And that is because in 1828 CE, Andrew Jackson, a longtime opponent of all Native American nations, would be elected President of the United States. Just 2 years after that, on April 24th, 1830 CE, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act would be passed by a very narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 101 to 97 in the House of Representatives. Which in itself shows that this bill was by no means universally accepted. It was by no means universally wanted at all. But unfortunately, for the Native American nations in the Southeast especially, but in other places, as we talked about in the previous video on Black Hawk's War, this bill still passed. Following the passing of the Indian Removal Act, the Muscogee Creek National Council would eventually, realizing that they were facing either becoming citizens of the United States and no longer citizens of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, or migrating west and keeping their nation, their confederacy intact, the Muscogee Creek National Council would cede their remaining lands east of the Mississippi to the U.S. and would accept relocation to Indian territory west of the Mississippi in what would eventually become known as the Treaty of Cassetta, which was signed on March 24th, 1832 CE. Though it is important to note, while the treaty pledged to remove all intruders from the ceded land until it had been surveyed in its entirety by the United States, and all members of the Muscogee Creek Nation Confederacy not becoming United States citizens have migrated west, i.e., no one from the United States could enter until all members of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy were gone, essentially. Despite these promises in the treaty, Alabama Governor John Gale, or Gailey, would denounce the treaty as government interference and would actually start allowing white speculators, settlers, and squatters to begin stealing Muscogee Creek land, which you can sort of see here. Which actually brings me to my next section, the Second Creek War. So, angered at this continued white encroachment, and of course, the complacency of Governor Gales, many Muscogee Creek Micos of the lower Muscogee Creek towns, such as Neamathla, would begin to gather warriors. After gathering the warriors, they would then start attacking white settlements. They would attack and disrupt mail stagecoaches and mail coaches, and then they would eventually attack and burn down Roanoke, Georgia, all of which would ignite what would become known as the Second Creek War in 1836 CE. Within the following months, the Alabama and Georgia militia forces would battle the Muscogee Creek warriors in several inconclusive battles, such as the Battle of Shepherd's Plantation and the Battle of, and I apologize, I'm probably going to butcher this for everyone who's in South Georgia, Echawana Chihuahua Creek. I horribly butchered that. I apologize. But they would battle the Muscogee Creek warriors in these inconclusive battles. And essentially what would happen is they would they would catch up to the Muscogee Creek warriors, and there would be small skirmishes and a few casualties would happen, but generally no significant victory would be accomplished for either side. And oftentimes the Muscogee Creek warriors would return to their old tactics of using the dense forest and swamps to just sort of escape and evade the Georgia and Alabama militia forces. In response to these Muscogee Creek raids, Andrew Jackson would appoint General Winfield Scott and General Thomas Jessup to lead the United States Army to defeat the Muscogee Creek warriors. And here's Winfield Scott and Jessup. After those appointments, Winfield Scott and Jessup would go on to recruit the several Micos of the upper Muscogee Creek towns, such as Apothigahola and Manawa. Manawa, as you remember, had actually fought in the Creek War against the United States. But the reason he's fighting alongside the United States at this point is he seems to have decided that fighting the United States was not necessarily worth the trouble. This is not necessarily a universal belief among the Muscogee Creek, but it seems to have been his own personal belief. But they would be recruited by specifically Winfield Scott and Jessup, and they themselves would bring 1,200 Muscogee Creek warriors to act as auxiliaries in this war and fight alongside the United States. Which actually means we need to take a look at what the United States soldiers and weapons looked like at the onset of the Second Creek War. So at the onset of the Second Creek War, the United States soldiers generally looked something like this. This would be sort of the standard uniform hat that they wore. Of course, this was not the standard uniform necessarily. This would be more like a personal uniform. This would be closer to the sort of standard uniform that they wore. But, this would be sort of what they look like. And of course, there would be some variation. After all, these were infantrymen, and these were generally cavalrymen known as dragoons. And that's because during this point in time, the United States was more and more beginning to expand into the Great Plains region of the United States, meaning they, of course, needed more and more horse-bound soldiers to be able to, keep up with the Plains and Native American nations who were horse-bound militaries. And then the weapons that they would use during this point in time included things like for infantrymen, the infantrymen would carry as one of their sidearms a short sword known as a artillery sword, whereas dragoons and military officers would wield sabers like this. Though it's also important to note there was some degree of soldiers, both dragoons and infantrymen, wielding Bowie knives as sidearms and close quarters weapons as well. But this was more of a personal choice. They were not standard issue weapons. Standard issue weapons would be the artillery sword and the saber, but you were still allowed to decide whether or not you, as a soldier, wanted to have a Bowie knife. It just wouldn't be as common as the saber or the artillery sword. And then, of course, not surprisingly at all, I'm sure to anyone watching, a lot of the standard sort of mid-range sidearm for every United States soldier, both dragoons and infantrymen, would be a pistol. And I say mid-range because, of course, a pistol does not have as long a range as a rifle, but it has a longer range than, say, a sword or a knife. And then, of course, they would also wield a variety of different types of muskets, whether they be the standard type of musket that is muzzle loaded, or a relatively new style of musket that was becoming more and more frequent, called breech loading muskets, where you would either load it from the top, or as you see in this model here, you would load it from the stock of it. All right, so now let's go back to the general course of the war. So after Jessup and Winfield Scott were put in charge of the U.S. military in this war, the U.S. military would generally have a lot of very ineffective attempts to locate the Muscogee Creek warriors, and this would happen for weeks. And until eventually the United States forces would fight the Muscogee Creek warriors in the mostly inconclusive Battle of Brushy Creek. And again, very similar to the previous battles between the Muscogee Creek warriors and the militias. There were some casualties, but generally no one won the battle, and the Muscogee Creek warriors were still able to sort of use their use the dense terrain, the dense swamp in this specific case, to escape the United States forces. And they would actually also use the dense swamp to successfully flee to Florida, where they would join with the Seminole Nation. And this would happen in July 1836 CE. That being said, there were still some Muscogee Creek warriors from the lower towns remaining in Alabama and Georgia, and they would successfully use the dense forests and swamps, such as the Okefenokee Swamp, seen here, to hide from the United States Army. Meanwhile, both during and after the initial battles of the war, the United States would begin to forcibly remove the Muscogee Creek Nation from the United States. Well, more forcibly than they already were, because after all, the Treaty of Cassetta was not optional. It just was optional on when they had to leave, not that they had to, not optional on the choice of leaving. They still had to leave. So between January and October 1836, because of the Second Creek War, the United States would be like, all right, we're going to physically make you leave now, not in a few months, now. And that's talked about in great detail from a source that I've already briefly showed in the when I talked about the voluntary migrations to Arkansas. This is a dissertation by Christopher D. Havman titled "The Removal of the Creek Indians from the Southeast, 1825 to 1838," and it provides a wealth of information from primary sources that are most certainly available to the general public. However, as I discovered, they are only available if you go in person to the archives. They are not available online. hence why I'm using this dissertation. Anyways, so what was, because they were being forcibly removed, the Muscogee Creek people, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, was suffering quite a lot. For one thing, despite being given periodic days of rest on their forced march to specifically Oklahoma at this point, uh, sickness and death plagued all detachments as they moved west, uh, including much of this that was a combination of fatigue, malnutrition, and weather. Many Creeks were undernourished prior to leaving Alabama because they were not even able to harvest their year's crops. This, of course, was exacerbated by by the scarcity of provisions along the route. The weather conditions along the road were also a factor. They would often travel through intense heat, uh, as well as heavy rainfall. And anyone who's been in rainfall during a summer when it was like a day that got as high as 96 degrees Fahrenheit, um, or higher, that is terrible to work out and to walk out in. Dehydration, of course, afflicted many of these Muscogee Creek peoples because, again, high humidity means that you were not sweating, therefore means you're losing quite a lot of water. Sorry, means the sweat is not helping, um, and things like that. And in fact, many Muscogee Creek Mikos and headmen who were also sent along in this forced march, including Apothe would note that there was much sickness among their peoples, um, and that many children uh, died on the route, including Oche Yohola, a different individual by the name of Yohola, Oche Yohola's son. Apothe Yohola and other headmen noted here that the list uh, noted that some people died absent from their friends, um, and things like that. There were people who were, they had to buy coffins for their people dying along the way so that they could bury them in graves, and things like that. This was a terrible time of suffering for the Muscogee Creek. They also faced even more problems, including weather, bad roads, and swampy land as they moved beyond Little Rock, Arkansas. Roads began to disappear or become less developed, and as quoted here on this page, went from good to horrid. Apothe described it as very boggy and covered with water. Again, he notes the roads were bad, and that the nights were cold, and that their people were suffering. And in fact, during one attempt to cross a river, a wagon overturned and a horse drowned on the way. And then eventually, temperatures would go on to drop below freezing, and the torrents of rain would turn to snow, with, of course, the winter leading to much more suffering for the Muscogee Creek peoples. Another thing that happened would be that they were traveling in a thing that essentially would make their traveling through winter worse would be the fact that they were traveling in summer clothing instead of winter clothing. Then you really probably don't need to tell you why that was bad, why that made things worse. Uh, Many were in fact also walking without shoes and were badly clothed. They suffered greatly from being, having bare feet and thinly clad. Uh, they had nothing more than, in fact, cotton garments and things like that. Um, and they, in fact, also went on to continue to ask frequently for clothes and shoes to help with the situation, but they were not given that and at all. In fact, this condition was noted by individuals at Fort Gibson in Indian Territory, with the one quote saying, "The condition of the creeks yet on the road to Fort Gibson is most terrible. It is said that they are strewed along the road for a great distance. Many of them are almost naked without shoes. The snow for 5 days has been 4 to 8 inches deep. And during the first and second days of the storm, women and children were seen bending their way onward, crying for help." Uh, so now we're going to go back to the Second Creek War itself, because while the first stages of the forced removal was happening, eventually several leaders of the attack on Roanoke specifically would be captured and hanged in Phoenix City, Alabama, while other leaders of the lower Muscogee Creek warriors, such as Neomothila, would indeed be captured, but they themselves would be sent west on a forced march to Indian Territory. But the war was not was in no way over, because the lower town Muscogee Creek warriors, who had been hiding in places like Okefenokee Swamp, would initiate the second phase of the war by attacking a plantation known as Battles Plantation on December 29th of 1836 CE, where they would succeed in attacking and killing several people, though the owner of the plantation, Battle himself, would be able to narrowly escape. And then immediately afterwards, just 20 days later, the Muscogee Creek Warriors would quickly defeat the United States Army at both the Battle of Pugh's Plantation on January 20th of 1837 CE, and then just 8 days after that, they would defeat the United States Army at the Battle of Martin's Creek on January 28th, 1837 CE. However, despite these victories, the United States Army would quickly regroup and would eventually defeat the lower town Muscogee Creek warriors at the battles of Hodby's Bridge on February 10th, 1837 CE, and the Battle of Pea River on March 27th, 1837 CE. However, after these battles, after the battles of Hodby's Bridge and Pea River, these warriors would quickly disperse into smaller, more mobile groups, where they would then proceed to successfully flee to Pensacola, Florida, where they would essentially copy the earlier groups of Lower Muscogee Creek warriors who had already fled to Florida, and they would join the Seminole Nation in the ongoing Seminole War, which I've already done a video about. That will be linked in the iCard. But just for posterity, the duration of the Second Seminole War was from 1835 to 1842 CE. All right, so that brings us to our next section, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and Indian removal itself, the final Indian removal. So now, viewing the Second Creek War as complete, or as a victory, the United States would then gather the remaining Muscogee Creek citizens, eventually driving both, and this is the combined number for both the forced marches that were happening during the Second Creek War and after, eventually driving all 15,000 Muscogee Creek citizens west to Oklahoma Indian Territory, with, as we saw in the sources I provided, with little more than the clothes on their backs. Along the way, again, this is the combination of both the forced marches that happened during the Second Creek War and after. More than 3,500 Muscogee Creek men, women, and children would die along the 750-mile route, which would eventually become known as the Creek Trail of Tears, and this would happen in late 1837 CE. And again, it was a very horrific event for the Muscogee Creek. People died along the way. They had little to no provisions. Um, children, everyone had to be buried on the side of the road as they were just forced to march on and on through horrific winter conditions. Which brings me back to this dissertation where Havman very clearly states that the group of Muscogee Creek who were being forced out in this final removal were numbered around 3,000 to 4,000. And he also goes on to point out that essentially the situation was basically exactly the same as the forced marches and removals that were happening during the Second Creek War. People were a large number of the Muscogee Creek being forcibly removed during this final removal were sick, with many of them dying while at ports and wharfs, waiting to get onto boats to send them across, for example, the Mississippi River and things like that. Essentially, not only that, the weather was often stormy and rained heavily, rendering the situation, quote, very unpleasant. On top of a lot of them already being very sick, many of them would contract illnesses from previous camps within days of arriving. In fact, within days of arriving at one of the camps known as Pass Christian, 25 Muscogee Creeks died over a 2-day period. And then by July 31st of 1837, 84 creeks died Muscogee Creeks died at Pass Christian, with most of them being young children or the elderly. And, as we talked about a little bit earlier in the video, there had been a large minority of Muscogee Creek individuals who had already voluntarily migrated west in 1827 and 1828, with many of them living amongst the Chickasaw Nation. However, they also were in a low state of health and destitute of warm clothing. So pretty much across the board, this forced removal west of the Muscogee Creek by the United States resulted in disease, starvation, malnutrition, presumably a lot of hypothermia and dehydration, things like that resulted in a massive amount of Muscogee Creek people dying along the way. And this is sort of the general routes, the three main routes that the Muscogee Creek would have taken to Indian territory in Oklahoma. And then even once they got to their new lands in Oklahoma, in Indian territory, their suffering still did not end, because after arriving at Fort Gibson, after all of the Muscogee Creek Nation had finally arrived from both of the forced removals, the Army would essentially do nothing. They would basically just give each Muscogee Creek family a blanket and then be like, bye, and then abandon them. They didn't give them any rations, anything like that. They didn't give them shelter. They were just like, here's a blanket, you're on your own. Which, as you can imagine, resulted in still more people dying. All right, so now that leads us to our next section, the aftermath of the Second Creek War and Muscogee Creek Indian removal. So one thing that's very interesting and important to point out is that the lower town Muscogee Creek warriors who had fled to Florida during the Second Creek War continued to raid white American settlements. Now, admittedly, it would be sporadically, meaning it would happen, it would happen, there would be a few raids this year, and then there would be a couple of years where no raids would happen, and there would be more raids another year, etc., etc. And this would continue on that way until 1854 CE, just 7 years before the American Civil War, arguably meaning the Second Creek War did not end until 1854 CE. And it really only ended uh, because essentially there was no reason to. I don't want to say there was no reason to fight anymore, but it was essentially the fighting just began to die down organically. Meanwhile, in in Oklahoma, in Indian Territory, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy would reform, uh, and then would eventually become the Muscogee Creek Nation by 1855 CE, meaning it had become a lot more centralized. It was no longer based off of coalition; it had a one centralized government at that point. And then just 6 years after that, the Muscogee Creek Nation would side with the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War. And this would be for a variety of reasons. Of course, to get back at the United States for Indian removal, but also remember the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. Much of its economy was based off of African American chattel slavery in the cotton industry, and so of course they did not want to give that up. And so they sided with the Confederacy because the Confederacy most certainly started the Civil War over slavery. Sorry, Lost Causers. Deal with it. All right, and that leads us to our last section, the Muscogee Creek people today. So there are a couple of Muscogee Creek nations in existence today. The first is the Muscogee Creek Nation that is located in Oklahoma. And despite previous and continued attempts by the United States to destroy and erase their cultural practices and beliefs, the Muscogee Creek Nation and Muscogee Creek people are still holding on to their cultural beliefs and practices. And a very similar thing can be seen in the other Muscogee Creek Nation that's located in Alabama, known as the Porch Creek Indian Nation, located in southern Alabama. And again, they are still holding on to their cultural beliefs and practices, despite, again, previous and continued United States attempts to erase their heritage and culture. All right, that leads us to the end of this video. I hope you all learned a lot from this video. As I said in my previous two videos, I hope you enjoyed some parts of it, the parts that are related to the culture of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy itself. But in terms of the parts about the horrific things the United States did to the Muscogee Creek Confederacy and the Muscogee Creek people, I really hope you did not enjoy that. The point was not to enjoy that. The point was to learn and bring to the forefront what the United States did to them in this period of time. So with that, I'm going to end the video. If y'all want to see me cover any of the things that I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.